You're tuned in to the Dr. Kinney Show, and I'm your host, Dr. Erin Kinney, a naturopathic doctor and speaker dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of your body and guiding you back into balance. Let's get started.
Hey, real quick, guys, before we start the episode, I want to share something that I'm really excited about. I know how hard it can be when your hormones feel out of balance, low energy, mood swings, and not feeling like yourself, which is why I created the supplement line Optimal Harmony. With natural science-backed ingredients, it's designed to support your hormones, stabilize your mood, and help you reclaim your energy and confidence, because when your hormones are balanced, everything feels easier. You deserve to feel amazing every day, so let Optimal Harmony line of supplements help you get there. Check out the show notes for details on how to purchase and to find an exclusive discount code for my podcast listeners. Take care, guys. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Kinney Show. This week, I'm going to be sharing a couple of case studies of recent patients that have come in. And I want to share these case studies with you to highlight how important the basics or the foundations of your health can be. Sometimes, and I know I have a tendency to do this, if you've listened to my episode on hypochondriac or health anxiety, you'll know I am a huge hypochondriac, and sometimes I get a symptom and I immediately think, oh my gosh, I have Lyme disease, or I have this really complicated condition. And I sometimes see that in patients as well. They will come into my office and they'll describe their symptoms and they're like, I've been Googling and I think I have XYZ. And sometimes that very well may be true, and that's why it's important to work with a provider to kind of tease that out. But oftentimes, as we sit down and we start talking, we'll talk about their sleep habits and their dietary habits and their exercise habits and their alcohol consumption habits. And we actually uncover that maybe their complex symptoms are not something like a very serious chronic diagnosis, but actually their body's just yelling at them because they're not doing the basics of what the body needs in order to function properly. So let me share these couple of case studies so you can kind of see what I mean. I had a 42-year-old female come and see me probably a couple months ago. She was complaining of brain fog, fatigue. She had such bad brain fog. She had to leave her job for several months. She was tired all the time. She noticed like a redness on her face, a little redness on her nose. She was getting headaches. She was having some mild joint pain. She had digestive irritability, kind of like irritable bowel syndrome, some days diarrhea, some days constipation. She was breaking out in hives randomly. Her periods were starting to get a little wonky. So as you can see, pretty much every system in the body was not happy. Now, this patient also had a previous history of Lyme disease, which she'd been treated for probably 6 years prior to coming to see me. And when she first had Lyme, she had a very similar set of symptoms. She also at that time discovered she was living in a house that had black mold, so she had some mycotoxin illness, and she had done really everything for those. She'd, had the Lyme treated conventionally and alternatively. And she had a couple of years after that where she felt really good. She then got pregnant and she felt fantastic during pregnancy and fantastic during nursing. And so when she came to see me, she's like, I'm really worried that I have contracted Lyme again, or the Lyme is back, or possibly there's mold in my house. Can we test for that? And honestly, when she first sat down, I was like, oh yeah, you kind of sound a little bit like someone who maybe has Lyme again. So I was like, but let's put that over there and let's talk about some of your basics. So we talked about her sleep habits, and she was falling asleep watching pretty intense, scary TV. She'd fall asleep on the couch. She'd wake up around midnight, and then she'd be wide awake. She'd go get in bed. She would doom scroll on her phone for maybe 1 or 2 hours. So she wasn't really going to bed until about 2 a.m. She had to wake up at 7 with her 3-year-old to get her off to daycare. She was exhausted. She was drinking probably 6 or 7 cups of coffee throughout the day, not enough water, and her diet was, a piece of toast, maybe something for lunch, maybe not, and then kid leftovers for dinner. So she wasn't consuming, enough calories nor enough protein, and she definitely wasn't getting fiber or vegetables. So diet and sleep were not amazing. Her periods were super, super out of whack, either really heavy 1 month, she'd get them every couple weeks, and she was like, maybe this is perimenopause, I don't know if it's hormones. So menstrual cycle wasn't doing that well. She had zero sex drive, and then her bowels were kind of all over the place, as I mentioned before. So we then started to talk a little bit about, we talked about the coffee. She was not drinking enough water. I asked her about her alcohol consumption, and she was like, oh, I drink like 2 a night. And I was like, okay, 2 what? She's like, well, 2 bottles. I was like, oh, 2 bottles of what? She's like, well, usually about 2 bottles of wine. She's like, but I've been doing that for years and years and years. Alcohol definitely doesn't have an impact on me. And she's like, besides, I cut it out. Sometimes I won't drink from Monday to Thursday and I don't feel any different. And that was a little bit of a red flag to me. 2 bottles of wine is quite a lot of alcohol. She's also weighs about 120 pounds and is maybe 5 foot. So a tiny human. So that seems like, and it was interesting to me that she felt great when she was pregnant and when she was nursing, which was when she was not consuming alcohol for a long period of time. Nevertheless, I still ran a whole bunch of tests on her. We looked for Lyme. We looked for more mycotoxins. We looked at all of her hormones. And when her labs came back, she was extremely surprised. I was mildly surprised. She was completely negative for Lyme. Her immune system looked decent, not like someone who has Lyme disease. She had 0 mycotoxins in her system. And her hormones, they were a little out of whack, but nothing crazy. She had pretty elevated liver enzymes, and her blood sugar was completely a mess. So what the blood work told me was that, okay, it really wasn't a super complicated, wasn't Lyme, wasn't mold, it was really, she was not taking good care of herself. She was drinking too much alcohol. She was not getting enough sleep. She was feeding herself poorly. And then we started to talk about some of things that were going on stress-wise and emotional-wise. And obviously she didn't feel good, which is extremely stressful. She's, got a little one at home, which can be stressful. But she started to talk about, trouble she was having in her marriage. She and her husband had been fighting. They hadn't been intimate in a long time. He was traveling a lot. She was at home. There was a lot of, disconnect there, and they weren't getting any support there. So again, I just wanted to use this story as a way to kind of highlight, this woman clearly did not, she really, really felt bad, but her body was screaming at her. It needed more sleep. It needed to be fed better food. It needed to be fed less alcohol, and she needed some good emotional support. And so we had to have some mildly difficult conversations, one about the alcohol. No one really likes to hear, hey, I think you're drinking too much alcohol. And she actually was pretty open to it. She said, oh yeah, my acupuncturist actually also agrees that maybe I'm drinking a little too much alcohol. I might be allergic to it, and maybe that's contributing to things. So she has decided she's going to quit drinking for 30 days and kind of see how she feels, which I think is going to be helpful for her. She's committed to drinking more water. She also had not been moving her body because she doesn't feel good. She's going to layer that piece in when she starts to feel better. But again, this is a really interesting thing to look at. Sometimes, again, when your body is really screaming at you, the symptoms can get really intense. It doesn't always mean that there's some sort of really complicated thing. Again, and I do just want to be clear, it can mean that there's something complicated, and you want to make sure that you rule that out and work with a provider can really help that. But if your system is yelling at you, whether it's headaches or bowel irregularity or fatigue or brain fog, look at your basics, look at the foundations, and make sure that you are doing as best you can to get those in a good place. Because oftentimes our body has a symptom because it's trying to tell us that it doesn't like what we're currently doing to it or what we're not doing for it, right? Maybe you're not eating enough protein. The body's like, wow, my blood sugar is going to be completely out of whack. I'm going to give you all these symptoms until you start feeding me enough protein throughout the day. Or again, maybe you're not drinking enough water. Not drinking enough water can cause brain fog and fatigue and insomnia and constipation and a lot of symptoms. So sometimes you really need to not sometimes, always, you need to make sure that those basics are covered and that they're in a good place. Now, everyone's life, there's always going to be things that are going to come up, and maybe you can't be perfect on those basics every single day of every week of every month. However, you can do your best to kind of do that. And it's interesting to see when you do give your body enough sleep, when you feed it what it wants, when you don't feed it the things it doesn't want, what it will do for you. And when you start to really learn, hey, like when I don't eat enough protein, X, Y, Z happens, then you can start to look at your symptoms as just kind of feedback from your body. Like, oh, hey, my body really liked that. I feel great today. Or, no, my body really didn't like that. I drank some weird caffeinated drink and then I crashed at the end of the day. That's maybe not something we want to do the next day because your body didn't like it. So sometimes it's also learning not to be fearful of whatever symptoms you're having because they don't always mean something's really, really wrong. It just means the body's trying to react to the thing it didn't like or try to tell you that it wants something else. So that's that case study. That patient, I've seen multiple cases similar to her. I just thought it was really interesting because, and so I have another patient that similarly, she was in her 60s when she first came in to see me, and she also had a history of Lyme. She'd actually been treated several times for Lyme. First couple times she'd been treated conventionally with antibiotics, had kind of gotten better. And then the last time the symptoms did not respond to antibiotics and she went through a protocol doing IV lasers and, like a really alternative, but really, really effective protocol. And she'd been feeling great for several years. Well, same thing. She sat down in my office. She had just moved here from, I think, California. And she's like, I'm really worried that my Lyme is back because I'm having brain fog again. I'm feeling anxious. I'm having trouble sleeping. I'm feeling a little like wired, but tired, like a little jittery. She's like, and these were all things I had back when I had Lyme that last time. She was also having some joint pain. She was not very hungry. Her appetite was way down and she'd lost some weight. So similar, I was like, okay, this is interesting. Typically if someone has had a history of having Lyme several times and a couple of kind of failed treatments, it is something that practitioners are going to think about. Oh, we definitely want to look into that. She was also very concerned the home that she'd moved into, they had to renovate it for some mold that they'd found. They didn't test what type of mold. So she was very worried that she was being exposed to mold. And she was like, maybe I moved into a moldy house. It made me sick and I contracted Lyme again. Anyways, so we do the same thing. We run a whole panel on her. And now this patient, she was eating very well. She had an excellent diet. She was eating enough protein. She was eating enough vegetables. She drank plenty of water. Her alcohol consumption was very, very low. She maybe drank 1 to 2 drinks a week, if that. She seemed to tolerate it pretty well. She also was having a lot of stress in her life. However, she had a couple of kids that had just gone off to college. One of them had been extremely sick. Her other child had gotten a diagnosis of something. I can't remember exactly what the diagnosis was, but again, a lot of stress with her children. Her husband traveled all the time. So her stress levels were high. She was not currently getting support. They had just moved across the country. So there was a lot of things going on, right? And when we got her labs back, this was really interesting. Again, her Lyme was completely negative. There was no evidence of mycotoxins, which she was completely relieved about. She had gotten a diagnosis of hypothyroidism during her second pregnancy. So we're talking, 45 years prior. I think actually maybe it was 30 years, some long amount of time prior, she'd gotten a hypothyroid diagnosis and she'd been on a pretty consistent dose of Synthroid, and which is synthetic T4. And she had maybe adjusted the dose once or twice. She had a major increase in her Synthroid dosage while she was being treated for Lyme the last time because her thyroid took quite a dip. And this is really common when you're undergoing, when your body's dealing with a major infection. Sometimes we will see the thyroid kind of crash a little bit. So she'd upped her Synthroid dose and had felt much better. When we checked her labs, she was in a 100% hyperthyroid state. Her TSH was like 0.00005, which is very, very low, meaning her thyroid was in overdrive because she was actually taking too much thyroid medication. Now, no one had really checked her levels. She'd kind of been between providers during the move and whatnot. And so I think what happened in her case was she actually was taking such good care of herself. Her basics were so good and her body had, completely recovered from this, massive infection. So she actually needed less of a medication that she'd been on, and that kind of hadn't been checked. So she basically had been on a too high dose of thyroid medication. Hard for me to know how long the dose had actually been too much for her, but probably for at least 6 months to a year. And when you tweak the thyroid a little bit too much, you kind of you can put the adrenals into a crash state. So her cortisol was also insanely low. So she had this really hyperactive thyroid. And when your thyroid is really hyperactive, you're going to feel anxious. Sometimes you lose weight. You might have brain fog. You have a hard time focusing, similar to sometimes what people feel when they have hypothyroidism, except there's this little bit of the body's just revved up from too much thyroid hormone. But if you rev the thyroid for too much for too long, it will crash out your adrenals. And so, like I said, her cortisol was extremely low, which will make brain fog, fatigue, and all these other things way, way worse. If you've listened to my episodes on cortisol, you understand why that is. So, and she was kind of in shock. She was like, wait a second, I don't have Lyme. There's no mold in my house. This is fantastic. And I was like, I think, you've done such a good job. She had done such a good job taking care of her body, taking care of the basics, that she'd actually basically healed her thyroid since it had, struggled a little bit on the Lyme. She'd recovered from, mycotoxin and Lyme and all these other things. And so her body had actually gotten better and needed less medication. So I thought it was really interesting because these two cases came in kind of around the same time. I think it was the same week. And it was just an interesting reminder for me, actually, that, hey, the basics are so important and they can either really, really help you such that you might not need as much of a medication that you were taking, or they can really, really upset your system that, you feel like you're back in a state where you might have some other chronic diagnosis. So again, really looking at how good a job are you doing with your sleep, with your diet, with, and the other piece, the second patient, she was so good about getting outside. She walked every day, rain or shine. She knew that nature made her feel better. And so she made that a part of her daily routine. The first patient I mentioned, I didn't talk about that. She was like barely getting outside. She was, again, not exercising because she didn't have the energy. She was sitting inside pretty much all day long, not working, and mildly depressed, I think because of how she felt, but she wasn't getting sunlight. She wasn't getting out in nature, which is another really important basic. So, I urge you, if you're listening to this episode, to really start by taking inventory. Hey, let me start by looking at my diet. Get out a journal, write down, what am I eating for breakfast? What am I eating for lunch? What am I eating for dinner? Am I eating snacks? Am I craving anything? And then look at, what are you drinking throughout the day? What do you drink in the morning? What do you drink throughout the day? Are you drinking enough water? Typically for water, you want, about half your body weight in ounces. And if you're drinking caffeine, or if you're drinking alcohol, you probably want to add an extra 8 ounces for each caffeinated or alcohol drink. So sometimes that's a lot more water than what people are drinking. So looking at water consumption, looking at sleep habits. And I think this is we've had many episodes where we've talked about sleep. Getting good sleep is so, so important. And looking at your sleep hygiene before you go to bed can really make a difference. So again, if you're looking at screens or on your phone, or, and TV is fine, but you might want to just look at hey, what am I watching before bed? If you're watching really intense, scary, creepy shows, that's going to jack your cortisol up while you're watching those, which is going to disrupt your circadian rhythm. And so, and I hear this from a lot of patients where they will watch TV around 9 or 10 p.m. They fall asleep on the couch. And so in their mind, they're like, well, it must not be too stressful for me because I'm falling asleep. But then when they wake up to go to bed, they're wide awake. And it's a really common thing. They'll be on their phone or do something else to try to fall asleep. But then, you've disrupted that sleep some. So then when you go to get up in the morning, you're tired, you're dragging, you're going to need more caffeine. You might reach for more sugar. So as you can see, the sleep starts to it has a snowball effect on what happens the next day. So typically what I recommend is, if you're going to watch TV, try to be done with that TV. If you're trying to go to bed by 10, be done watching TV by 8:39, so that if you have about an hour to kind of decompress, go upstairs, maybe read a book, take a bath, do something that helps the nervous system wind down. And the more blue light that you are consuming before bed, the more you're going to disrupt your melatonin production. So I often will recommend, and again, I've talked about this in other episodes, I will recommend taking a small dose of melatonin before you go to bed to kind of help reset the circadian rhythms. It's common practice when you are traveling through time zones to take a little bit of melatonin to kind of reset. But if you are having a disrupted sleep, pattern, using a little melatonin about an hour before sleep can kind of help start to regulate that. The other thing that can help sleep, and this helps kind of the outside nature thing that we talked about, is getting morning sunlight. So get outside, try to get outside before 10 a.m. and make sure your eyes are, exposed to the sun. So without sunglasses, preferably for 10 to 15 minutes. Even if you just take a 10-minute walk, or, if you're driving to work, don't wear your sunglasses for a bit, because that will actually tell the brain, oh, it's morning. I should be awake. I should be producing cortisol. Melatonin should be low now, which will help the rhythm work throughout the rest of the day. And you're going to get that outside nature piece, which I like to call nature vitamin N. And I think it's the most underutilized vitamin in our society. So many of us, we're on Zooms, we're on meetings, especially in the winter, it gets hard. We don't really want to be outside. It's cold. It's not super sunny. We're here in Maryland, and this past week has been beautiful. And I have seen everyone's like, get me outside. It feels amazing. It's been 60 degrees and it's February, and we're all really excited about that. But so the more you can get outside, we are like complicated houseplants. We need sunlight. It is so important for not only just our vitamin D, but actually I did an episode, this was maybe a couple years ago, and it was the author of the book Quench, and she shared some really interesting research and really interesting insights that when you're exposed to sunlight, it actually restructures your cells so that the cells can hold on to more water. So the more sunlight you get exposed to, the better hydrated your cells will be, which again, you think about a plant. If a plant does not get sunlight, the leaves will shrivel and wither and die. So our cells, the same thing will happen if you don't get enough sunlight. And think about, there's all these memes about, when you're in the dead of winter and you're pasty and your body just feels shriveled and old. Part of that is because we're not getting sunlight. And this is why most people, you go and you spend a day in the sun and you just feel so rejuvenated, because it's actually keeping your cells better hydrated. So get outside. And there's also tons of really cool research where just looking at a plant, and not even just a plant, you could look at a picture of a plant if you're, if let's say you're traveling and you don't have time to get a full outside dose, you can look at a picture of a plant and it will actually help your nervous system regulate its cortisol production. So if your cortisol levels are too high, it will lower the production. If your cortisol levels are too low, it will actually bring it back up. So you probably can't see in the shot, but we have lots of plants in our office, because I'm like, when I come to work, I need to make sure that I'm seeing plants so my cortisol doesn't go too high, or if it's low, I need some of that plant support. Plants also produce more oxygen, and then when we're breathing more oxygen, we tend to feel better. So getting outside, get that vitamin N is so, so important. Okay, so we talked about diet, hydration, getting outside, sleep. And then the movement piece is really, really important. And, this might depend on where you are in your health journey. If you're super fatigued and not feeling great, maybe, crazy amounts of exercise are not going to feel that great, but your body does need to move. So taking a walk, or if that feels too much for you, doing some stretching, doing some yoga, or even just doing some seated breath work. The more you move your body, the more you're going to activate that fascia, and you're going to help detox the lymphatic system. And so when we're too stagnant, that can start to cause problems in the system as well. So, I think really the easiest and best thing you can do is take a walk outside. You're going to hit a lot of the things I just talked about. So that's a great habit stack for kind of these basics. And then it's really good practice to kind of take inventory of what's going on with my stress, what's going on with me emotionally. Is there something that I'm feeling but not addressing? I'm a huge advocate for therapy. Therapy is fantastic support. And if that's not your jam, maybe journaling could be something. It's really just making sure that you don't have some sort of emotion that's getting stuck inside your body, right? So this morning I was helping my 12-year-old daughter get ready for school. And she was really, really mad at herself because she'd lost her script for the play that's happening next week. And she was having a tough morning. She's a teenager and hormones are all over the place. And she was so angry. And she tends to be, when she gets angry, she doesn't really know what to do with it. And she kind of hunches over. And it's almost like you can watch the anger go inside of her. And so we've been working together, her and her therapist, on ways that she can get that out of her. Because what happens, and I'll watch her do this, she gets really, really mad and she doesn't like to express it. So she'll kind of turn inward and then she slumps over and then she gets paralyzed. And this morning, and I was watching her and I'm like, hey, you got to make your lunch and we got to get ready for school. And she's like, I just feel like I can't do anything. So we went outside and I had her scream and yell, and I gave her this egg carton that she smashed with a hammer. And so she got some of the anger out. And then she started to be able to go about her day, and she started to feel better. So this process can look different for everybody. If anger is the thing, you need to figure out how to get it out. If sadness is the thing, do something that makes you cry. Or, it might be that you're really excited and you're trying to contain that. But whatever the emotion is, you want to make sure that does not stay stuck in the body, because stuck emotions are going to turn into physical symptoms if nothing happens to them. Emotions are energy. They are energy in motion. If you want to go back and listen to the episode I did with Dr. Marissa Catapano, who does neo-emotional release, we're going to have her back on the show in a few weeks. But she talks a lot about how, again, emotions are supposed to be energy in motion. They're supposed to move through you. If they stay stuck in your body, it can turn into things that we don't want happening in our body. So taking, again, inventory of that. And sometimes in today's world, I know I'm guilty of this all the time. When we're so busy, something might trigger an emotion and you're like, wow, I feel something, but I don't actually have time to feel that right now. So we have a great coping mechanism where we put the emotion away. And sometimes that's super helpful. I know I've had days where kid stuff or whatever comes up and I'm like, crap, you know what? I got to go record some podcasts, or I have to go to work and see patients. I can't really process or deal with that right now. But if you do that too much and you never set the time or the space to process those, guess what? They're going to stay stuck and they're not going anywhere, and they will turn into a physical symptom. So, if you don't have time to process something in the moment, this is where having, a weekly therapy session or just setting aside some time every week where you can be like, oh, okay, you know what? That thing came up on Monday. I need to talk to my partner about that. Or I need to have a conversation about my child because, with my child because this really upset me. I need to work through this. Or maybe you don't need to talk to anybody else. Maybe you just need to process what you were feeling on your own. But again, the point is you want to figure out something that will help you get that emotion out of you. Because I think this is probably the most underlooked at impact on our system in particularly the Western medical world, but also I think sometimes in the functional medicine space. I think a lot of times, doctors were quick to be like, especially in the functional medicine world, we're quick to like, well, let's run these labs. Let's spend thousands and let's do an oat test and let's do this test and let's find all the things. And not to say that those things can't be valuable, but they can. But if the emotional piece is not something that you've looked at, I encourage you to look at that piece first before you dive into all the complicated physical stuff. Because sometimes, you might just have an emotion that's like hanging out in your, in your digestive tract that has been stuffed down there for so long that if you let that clear out of the system, whatever symptoms you're dealing with may regulate on their own. I know for me personally, anxiety tends to be a symptom or an emotion that comes up for me a lot, but it's typically when I get really anxious, it's usually there's some other type of emotion, whether it's anger or sadness that I have stuffed down. And it's almost like I've stuffed it down so much that it's like the anxiety is like, it's almost like a pot that's got a top on it and it's starting to boil. And like, when you feel anxious, you're like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. And I'm feeling all anxious. But so if you take the lid off and you let the emotion come out, typically whatever that, top emotion, which anxiety can often be, can get better. So I typically, when I get really anxious, I'm like, oh, you know what? I think maybe I might need to cry. I haven't cried in a while. And sometimes you can identify what the sadness was being caused by, right? Sometimes you might not even know, and it doesn't always matter what triggered it. It's just you need to move that energy through you. So anyways, another kind of like foundational thing that I think is really important to address if it's not something that you've looked at. And I think that might be all we've got for today. So just some things for you guys to think about. Again, I hope you enjoyed those case studies and really focus on your basics. And I always am amazed at what I see when my patients come back and they're like, wow, I really took the time to take care of all these foundational things and I feel amazing. And I know in my own life when I, keep my schedule in a place where I can do all those things and I take care of my sleep and I make sure I eat enough protein and I drink all the water and, all the things we've talked about today, my body functions really well. So I'm going to leave that there. I hope you guys enjoyed and I will see you next week. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to connect with me on social media to find more helpful tips and information. You can find me at Dr. Kinney on all of the platforms. And please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and/or a review. This helps grow the show so more people have access to this knowledge that leads to empowered healing. Love and light, and see you next week.